We would be talking about incident response from Ashwin Patel. He's a senior program manager for Microsoft Threat Intelligence Department. We talk about incident response in a cloud environment. How do you start if you have not done security operations in cloud yet? What you should be looking for in terms of data sources. Great episode to get into. Let me know what you think in the comment below. Let's get into the episode. Welcome to Cloud Security Podcast. Today, I've got a special guest from the US, Ashwin Patel. I got recently introduced to him through a few of the blog articles that he wrote about Capital One and AWS Azure Sentinel. But that and more, a lot more. Ashwin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So people who don't know you, how would you introduce yourself to the rest of the audience?
Yeah, so my name is Ashwin Patel, as you already said. So I work as a senior program manager for Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. So my team is, the short form is like Mystic, Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. And then my role is like senior program manager. So I'm part of the Mystic R&D team. My day-to-day work involves writing detections on various data sources, including cloud. We pretty much publish my detections on the GitHub. I do like a bunch of Python dev work as well. So my team has written like an open source library called MysticPy, which does some of the data analysis and data investigation for various security event data sources. And also it has some Jupyter Notebook utilities to do some impactful visualization on security event log data sources.
Awesome. And that's definitely a good segue into Capital One article that's been floating around on the internet and how AWS CloudTrail and Sentinel and how Sentinel can consume CloudTrail. So people who don't know about what I'm talking about, how would you explain what you guys did and what that talk when the blog was about?
Right. So we did. So I did a couple of blogs around the Capital One breach back in November. So like the Azure Sentinel is recently came last year. So one of the things that we have been trying to do is like coming up with the more case studies so that to show like how the Azure Sentinel can be used in a real world environment. So the Capital One breach was a very good example where we can show the AWS on Azure story. So Azure Sentinel has like a built-in integration to read logs from the CloudTrail. So that's how we started thinking about how we can show the Capital One breach analysis using Azure Sentinel platform, right?
Yep.
So what we did, we used some simulation software. So big shout out to like Rhino Security Labs. They came up with the open source tool called CloudGoat. So that particular tool is basically a bunch of Terraform scripts through which you can pretty much simulate the same vulnerable infrastructure in your AWS lab environment, right?
Oh, right.
So
what's an example of a vulnerable environment that it creates?
So similar to Capital One, right? So if we take example of Capital One, so we have like one virtual private cloud with one EC2 instance deployed, which has a web application, which is misconfigured with SSR flaw. And then it has a backend S3 bucket, right?
Ah, okay.
Right. So it basically has this vulnerable misconfiguration already set up.
Oh,
right?
sweet. So that's what you guys use.
Right. So that makes life much more easier for us. So you can just execute the Terraform scripts and have the lab infrastructures ready, right?
Yep.
And then the tool also has like very pretty good guidelines around like how do we simulate the same steps that attacker might have done, right? So this is still like a simpler way to simulate what happened in the Capital One. The actual attack may have been like a bit complex, but the TTPs are the same, right?
Yeah.
So what happened?
Quickly, for people who don't know what TTP is.
Yes, it's the tactics, techniques, and procedures. That's pretty much the different ways that attacker can gain access to your environment.
Thank you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So the TTP was quite similar or different?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. So once you deployed the vulnerable infrastructures, so you can start executing some commands. So what happened so the simpler explanation of Capital One breach is like you have sensitive data stored in a private S3 bucket, which is not accessible from the public, right? And that which is not accessible from public, right? So, and then you have like a vulnerable web site, which is hosted on the EC2 instance, which is misconfigured, right? So it has a SSRF flaw.
Yeah.
So with the SSRF flaw, you can basically initiate requests to your internal infrastructure, right?
Yep.
And then, so with that setup, the attacker can just send like a curl web request by sending requests directly to the EC2 metadata proxy.
Yep.
With which you can get the instance credentials and that sort of thing, right?
Sure.
So once you basically issued the curl web request to the instance metadata proxy, you will get the credentials for the IAM role, which is the identity. And what happened is the identity has the highly permissive role, which is like S3 full access was given to that identity. Right. So once you compromise or once you dump the credentials for that identity, you can basically list all the S3 buckets because you already have that access, right?
Yeah.
And then you can list down the buckets, and then you can figure it out what is the private bucket which has sensitive data. And then it's just a matter of time that you can use the S3 APIs to basically copy that data from S3 bucket to somewhere remote.
Sure. And Sentinel, how did Sentinel play a part in all this?
Right. So if we take the whole attack, so you need to, I mean, as an analyst, like you need to understand like where are the, which are the data sources that you can identify, which will detect these activities, right?
Yeah.
So AWS has like various monitoring data sources that they are published on the web page, which is like CloudWatch, CloudTrail, then S3 access logs, VPC logs, right? So there are a bunch of others, right? So in this scenario, we can see like there is a CloudTrail as well as the S3 related operations have happened, right? So what you can do is basically onboard the respective data sources into the Sentinel, and then start writing detections to detect that sort of activities.
Oh, right. Okay. So is it, okay. So for it's something that we have to define, or Sentinel would be able to detect it itself, or I guess, because that's kind of where people get lost. Is it going to be having some kind of AI machine learning behind it, or is it going to be something that you notice as a behavior which is not good, and then you configure Sentinel to detect that in the future? Is that how it is?
Right. So in this case, like we did like some research to basically come up with what actually happened, and then how do we detect those tactics or TTPs, right?
Oh yeah.
So in this case, we basically onboarded the log data sources, and then came up with some repeatable logic that we can turn into a detections, right? And then once we have those logic onboarded, so once we have those rules onboarded, you can basically detect similar type of activities from the future.
All right. And I think to your point, Sentinel was able to consume AWS CloudTrail, but does it go beyond that as well? Like, can it go other cloud providers, and like what else can it be consuming? To your point, data sources wise, what else it could be doing?
Yeah, so there are also like work in plan to onboard GCP and other cloud providers.
Oh wow!
As well as the AWS has the S3 access log, which does not go to the CloudTrail, right? So you need to have like a S3 access logs enabled, and then that will potentially go to the S3 bucket, right? So you need to have like that log ingestion pipeline so that you will bring that data into the Sentinel, right? So in this case, what we did was like we used the Logstash, which is again like community supported. There are like community supported plugins available. So Logstash has the S3 input plugin and the Sentinel output plugin, right? So
sweet.
You can get the logs from the S3 bucket and then send logs to the Sentinel.
Okay. So maybe let's take a step back then. I guess if I have an AWS environment, I have an Azure environment, I may be an enterprise, what do you recommend for people who have not started doing threat, I guess, who haven't really considered SOC for cloud? They're still doing on-prem SOC, and they're looking at, well, how do I do SOC in the cloud? And what do you recommend to those folks, especially who may have no, I guess maybe starting off today and have no idea? what do you recommend as the first baby steps they could be doing? And if Sentinel would be the first step, or should that be step 3, 4? But it'll be interesting to know for people who are listening in, if they want to start doing some kind of threat analysis of their cloud environment, how do they do that? And what should be almost like a strategy for threat and monitoring?
Right. So, I mean, coming up with the security monitoring strategy involves a lot more discussion, right? So,
Oh yeah, broader discussion.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it starts with identifying your assets and infrastructures, how scattered it is across clouds or across from on-premises to cloud.
Yep.
So, first step is like basically identifying like how your assets are deployed, and
Yep.
then how are we maintaining those inventory, right? The second thing is like there is you need to come up with like some log collection strategy. So on premises it's much simpler, like you can have like a centralized log collection strategy and start collecting logs, but in the cloud it can get a little bit complex, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
because you can imagine like, I mean, so I've been doing like security monitoring since like 10, 11 years.
Yep.
So back in the days, like we used to have like some internal network and just have some DMZ zone, which has some web server having like public interface and all. And then
Yep.
there is a perimeter, right? So you can
Yep.
deploy devices at the perimeter and then start collecting logs or start monitoring those things, right? So
Yep.
your perimeter was much well defined in those cases. But with the IT landscape has evolved a lot, right? So you have like bring your own device, and then now you have like cloud. So you can right now you can basically have like your serverless application
Oh yeah.
deployed in a deployed in a container and hosted in Azure cloud, right? So
Yeah.
the log collection strategies will be a lot different in the cloud, right?
Yep.
So yeah, so I think there's like thoughtful discussion in needs to be done, like when you are developing your like cloud collection strategies. So most of the cloud providers have guidelines around like what are the log sources that are available and how do we consume logs. They also have like some built-in controls that you can enable and have
Yep.
like, some built-in alerts enabled, right? So for example, for Azure, we have like Azure Security Center. So
Yep.
once you have those assets or workloads enabled, the ASC will start uh, basically guiding you like about securing those assets. So in Azure, we have like something called Secure Score, which will
Okay.
basically start recommending like the basics, baby steps, right? So patch your systems or like have MFA enabled or that sort of like various guidelines, right?
Yep.
And then once you start mitigating one by one, and then once you are ready, then basically the log collection or the Sentinel comes into picture.
Right. Right. Oh, so and is configuring Sentinel as simple as say, oh, I'm just gonna start giving out the logs, or
Right. So the good thing is like Sentinel can be deployed as just a resource in the cloud. So which is much simpler than the traditional SIEM solutions, right? So with the traditional SIEM solution, you need to invest like time and resources to basically stand up server and do that sort of things, right? With the
yep.
Sentinel, it's just like one click that you can basically deploy it in the cloud as a resource. And then the Sentinel has something called as data connector. So it
Yep.
has a native integration with the most of the Azure services. So it's pretty much like a one-click button to onboard those native Azure services.
Yep.
For AWS and some of the third-party providers also have like data connectors available. So yeah.
Oh, so okay, so if I'm listening to this for the first time, I guess first step is to have my assets listed, how
Mm-hmm.
like profiling all the assets that I have, all the applications that
Mm-hmm.
I'm running across multiple clouds. The second one would be once you've done that, if it's an Azure, go for Azure Security Center, and
Mm-hmm.
then once you start basically cleaning that up, next step
Mm-hmm.
for I guess threat detection and monitoring perspective, you would go into Sentinel
Right.
and basically it should be have out of the box connectors anyways, but if you have AWS you can go add another connector for it. Is that right?
Right. Right. Yeah. So uh, we talked till the data collection. So then later the identification will come into picture, right? So this Sentinel comes pre-built with detections that we have basically publishing on the GitHub, right? So it has more than 200 detections right now published on the GitHub for the
Right.
community to leverage.
Oh yeah, and I'll add the GitHub link to the show notes of the episode as
Mhm.
well. So that's a great basic start. And is it? What about people who may have PCI compliance or SOC compliance? Can that be added in Sentinel as well, or is that a separate thing?
Uh, I'm not sure about the compliance piece, but I believe like that will be a separate thing. Like, I mean, the PCI may have like their own check marks related to logging and auditing, so that can be fulfilled with the Sentinel.
Yeah.
And then there may be like other compliance aspects that may be covered by, let's say, Azure has its own vulnerability compliance or that sort of thing. So
Okay.
security and compliance may be a different aspect.
Oh, sure. And how does, because, and to your point about how SOC has kind of evolved, right? Threat detection was a very different thing when we were talking
Mhm.
on-prem world. It's almost like I imagine a guy looking at a log screen, basically is
Mhm.
looking for some way of identifying an anomaly. But these days, thanks to things like Sentinel and the stuff that other cloud providers are doing, a lot of it is automated. How
Mhm.
do you look at incident response in the cloud environment? To your point, it is so complex these days that you could have a container, then a function, and then it's just logged somewhere, but then you lose the virtual server in a matter of half an
Mhm.
hour, and you're like, well, I've lost everything. But how do you see incident response changing from what you had seen before and what it is now?
Yeah, so I mean, so I don't think like incident response has changed a lot. So it's
Hmm.
just like you need to get familiar with the tools and technologies that the cloud provider provides, and how do you fit that into your incident response plan, right?
Yeah.
So the traditionally the incident response has like a 4 or 5 stages. So it starts with preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, right?
Yeah.
So the preparation identification is it's pretty much like we covered like uh, finding out your asset inventory,
Yeah.
then collecting the log analysis, collecting the logs that are required, right? And then identification is pretty much like where you will start writing the rules, and then the response will come into picture like eradication and recovery. So let's say like if your one of your cloud resource has got compromised, let's say VM,
Yeah.
so you will have like various set of response control available from the cloud, right? So if you identified that particular identity is compromised, so you can basically block that identity, or you can send like password reset for those things via Azure Active Directory or that sort of things.
Oh, right. And to your point, the remaining two stages, you can create that as a detection in, or as a, I guess, something that you detect in Sentinel so that in future, if it happens again, you get notifications for it or there's an automatic action that happens.
Right. So the Sentinel has like the SOC workflow, right? Once you enable the specific rules, it will start creating the incident, right?
Yeah.
And then once the incident triggers, that's when your incident response plan will start, right? So for the Sentinel, we have something called as Logic App, which is basically an automated investigation that you can do. So it will basically like once the incident is triggered, you can basically have like Logic App action to basically uh, push a rule to the firewall to basically block that IP, or you can send a request to the Azure Active Directory to block that identity or block that device. That sort of
Oh, okay. And I don't know if this is the right question to be asking here, but do you have any examples of any incidents that you may have seen and how it was like? What's a good way to respond to an incident in Azure? And there's one way to do it in AWS. There's another way to do it in Google Cloud. Is
thing. Mhm.
there a almost? And I'm thinking for the listeners who are listening in, who haven't even thought about what do I do when there's an incident in Azure? Like Sentinel is great, but
Mhm.
it's something I have to detect first before I can put in Sentinel. What do you see as, I guess, a good incident workflow, I guess, for isolation? So a virtual server is compromised. And I'm
Mhm.
assuming you have to isolate it. You basically change the security group around it, or what? I mean, what does that look like in your mind?
Right. So, I mean, Azure has like a bunch of security products portfolio already built in, right? So we have like for the endpoint specifically, we have like Microsoft Defender ATP. which is basically endpoint detection and response solution, so EDR solution, right?
Yeah.
So that allows you to basically centrally manage your endpoints and then have like automated response. So once it detects that the endpoint is compromised or infected, through the EDR itself, that you can basically have like a response mechanism to isolate that host from the network, right? So you can trigger that workflow as part of the Defender ATP, or you can also have like a logic app to which will basically wait for a specific incident to trigger in Sentinel and then reach out to the Defender ATP to basically do that response action.
Right. Okay. Also, it's very different in the sense because I think a lot of people look at isolation very differently in the cloud provider because they're almost like, well, I need to give my forensic team access to this server once it's all isolated. How would that play out over here? So the EDR would be able to isolate the instance, and the forensic team would be onboarded, or I guess if they were not already there, but if it's already there, can that virtual server be given access to through another virtual server with forensic tools on it?
Yeah, so the EDR has like when the EDR basically isolates the host from your internal network, EDR still has a way to communicate that isolated host, right?
Okay.
So you can basically communicate to that isolated host from the EDR. So the Defender ATP has a lot of command line utilities through which you can remotely gather some artifacts from the host, right? So the forensics is a whole different conversation, like how do we take memory images and disk images. So that will be a different workflow itself. But with the Defender, you can basically collect like important artifacts, what happened, and then how does it scope in the internal network or that sort of thing.
And for, I guess, for organizations who may be a lot mature, where the virtual server maybe not say not like not a pet but a cattle kind of a thing where it just comes up and goes every half an hour. In those kind of scenarios, does the Defender ADP still kind of comes in handy? Or I guess because the endpoint doesn't really exist anymore, how would you, and this is me thinking out loud, right? Because I'm like, I didn't even know that would be a real case, but if that were to be the case, then you would go into Sentinel to see what had happened in the past, or how would this play out in the Azure ecosystem?
Yeah, so I mean, so this transient assets is like pretty challenging in most of the enterprise environment that we have seen. So you will almost have like some process wherein like assets will come and go up. So monitoring those assets is always challenging.
Yeah.
So in those cases, I think the best possible way is like find out the other data sources through which you can monitor those things, right? So those assets will still go through your firewall and other network devices. So you can still monitor that activity from those data sources.
Yeah.
So because like once you provision a host, if you need to still follow certain actions to onboard it to Sentinel and start collecting those logs, right?
Yep.
So before it starts onboarding to Sentinel, if it just goes away, then you have to rely on other data sources to see like what activity it has generated.
Right. Wait, how often, and I think based on what you see and what you recommend, what do you see as the maturity level in Azure across the board? I'm assuming there's like some people who are really mature, have transient servers that come up and go every half an hour. Then there'll be other half which are manually deploying virtual server, which would never die. So do you see that disparity? Like, is there like a lot more mature people versus a lot less mature people? Like, is there almost like a average graph, I guess, that you have seen?
Yeah, I mean, so I do not work for most of the customer environments, but I've seen like this is the case. But this may not be like large portion of your network. It may be just like a small portion of your networks.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the coverage may look like a little off in those cases. So each organization tracks basically monitoring coverage of their assets. So with these special cases, that coverage get little complicated.
Oh, right. And to your point, so I guess going back to the monitoring of threat, because these days people are talking about internal and external threat.
Hmm.
Sentinel would be great for internal threat and external threat, as long as you have those data sources going into
Right.
Sentinel. Is that
Right.
right?
Right. Yep.
Ah, sweet. And which is the kind of the same as any other enterprise as well. Um,
Right.
okay, I've got, and because this is cloud security podcast, and I probably should have started off by asking, what is cloud security according to you? I'm going to ask that now. What do you think is cloud security for you? Like, what does that mean for you when someone says cloud security?
Yeah. So, I mean, as an analyst, we pretty much expect like to have those new assets to be defended and new data sources to be onboarded in our monitoring strategy, right? So
Yeah,
it's about getting familiar with the new attack vectors that the cloud will bring, and
yeah.
then how do we protect those attack vectors with some either the built-in alerts or to develop some new alerts.
Ah, sweet. And in terms of, and this is kind of like the next section on Mythbusters.
Hmm.
Basically, in this question, is there a myth that you hear about cloud security? Like, what's that one thing that you hear people talk about cloud security, and you feel like that's actually not true? Most common
Hmm.
that I get is that cloud is not secure, but I'm curious if you have heard of any other myths around cloud security.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, so as you said, like the cloud is not secure is pretty predominant that we used to get here a lot, but I guess it's pretty much the same. And then in security space, we actually start with the assume breach mindset. So
Uh,
that means that no matter how many like preventive controls that you have deployed, you have to accept the fact that that will basically fail at some point of time, and then you will get compromised. So your defender strategy should be like if even if your monitoring control fails, how do we defend against various sort of attacks?
Oh, and is there an example of this kind of a thing where, like, what's an example of, like a very simple example of this defending, almost like defensive layers, as I like to call it, the different layers of security? Is there
Hmm.
an example workflow that you would have seen or heard of, which is a very simple use case for this? And I don't know,
You mean to like
I
you
know
mean like for the assume breach?
yeah, assume breach part. Like, what's a,
Yeah. So in a simple term, like we used to have called depends in depth, right? So you'll have like multiple layers of like let's say you have a internal network, and then that is protected by firewall,
yeah,
an IDS IPS appliance, and then some other preventive appliance, right?
yeah,
And then you will have like a false sense of security that since you have like a lot of appliance, since the host is behind with a lot of monitoring controls, you don't need to worry about monitoring or defending that asset, right?
yeah,
Which is wrong. So you need to consider the fact that all of those the protective controls may fail by either by bypass or something happen on the host or some sort of activity, right?
yeah.
And then your host will get compromised. So you need to still have like a meaningful monitoring strategy around the host uh, to detect certain things.
Yeah, I think that's the example I was looking for as well. That's
Mhm.
awesome. Um, what's a cloud security actually, what's a SOC or a threat monitoring question you wish I had asked you, or from a cloud security perspective? Because I'm getting into the last section, which is the fun section, so which is not technical at all. So before
Mhm.
we get into the non-technical section, what's that one thing you wish I had asked you, or is not being talked about enough in cloud security or in threat detection and monitoring?
So I think most of the time, like people have like uh, presence in both on premises and cloud,
Yeah,
right? So they also need to think about like how does that pivoting works, right? So you may have certain identities which are basically have access to the both environment, right?
mm-hmm.
So most of the time what happens is like the attacker can come from the cloud, and then since it has access to your on premises, it will basically pivot to your internal networks, right?
Yeah,
So you need to have like that identity isolation or that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean that is where the monitoring strategy and those things come into picture. There are like, I mean, I guess like there are like certain standards like
CIS.
CIS or like NIST.
Yeah.
So they have basically published like how do we secure your cloud. So
Yeah.
that's like actually a good starting point, I would say.
Yeah.
And then each cloud provider has its own guidelines.
Oh yeah, of course. After that, it kind of goes into that territory.